Oh, thank you for introducing yourself. It's really good to know who's here.
So, could you introduce yourself?
I have done myself. No, my name's Sam Reed. I'm the Programme Assistant for Fermynwoods Contemporary Arts. I also have an artistic practice and do other things as well. Joanna, I'd like to invite you to start a conversation, if that's okay. You've brought some images with you, I believe.
Yes, I've brought various visual aids on bits of paper, so just to look at as and when. So I thought that, so I guess what we're trying to do is sort of look at where art and astronomy come together and the different ways they do, and to try to keep that, see how the conversation goes when we're sort of pivoting between the two. Oh, nice. Display. So I thought that I'd start by, I'd just say something about, I guess, there's these kind of decisive moments when you start to become interested in something, when something nudges your interest enough that you kind of feel there's going to be a pathway opening up for you. So I thought I'd just describe for me that moment, and then just kind of a brief chronology of the various astronomical context places that I've been involved with, just so that you've kind of got that background to begin with. So I thought what I'd tell you is that I studied fine art and history of art. We did a course on art in France, and the philosopher Henri Bergson kind of came up as being one of the people who influenced ideas around cafe society in the turn of the century. And Henri Bergson wrote The Creative Evolution and another book, Matter and Memory. And I picked up this book in the library, and he writes about time, and he writes about time being durational, and I was really fascinated by his ideas, because he says, oh well, the present is it's not the time on your watch doesn't, or your clock doesn't mean anything. It isn't necessarily the only kind of time there is, because we experience the past and we experience ideas about the future at the same time. And to me, that was wonderful, this idea of the experience of time. Now, I've got two brothers, and one did astrophysics. So I was at Edinburgh, and then my younger brother went to Manchester to do astrophysics. And my sort of crucial, decisive moment was in a cafe in Devon when I was there with all my family. And my brother started telling everyone Einstein's theory of relativity and that time and space were connected. And it was very compelling and very convincing. And I was thinking, well, that's not Bergson's idea of time. Bergson talks about time as being a very different kind of experience. And I suddenly realised at that time that there were parts of life that artists weren't looking at. And this is like the early 90s. And I thought, well, actually, if I start to look at astrophysics, then maybe I'll see something different. And I guess I was quite aware of the authority of scientific theory and fact, and I didn't like that because I was an artist. But also, I thought that there was something that needed to be put in context, that there were different stories to tell alongside each other. So I got in touch with Professor Lyne, I don't know if you know, through my brother at Jodrell Bank, and I thought I'll go there because it's such a stunning structure, and I wanted to just go and draw it. So rather than, I guess, use it for data, I wanted to say, well, okay, this is a visual phenomenon. Do you know when in Manchester you see it from the M6, you see it from the motorway, it's this iconic, it's a radio telescope. So I went and drew it and photographed it, and they turned it for me. And then it was, I guess in the 90s, Photoshop was starting up, and people were starting to learn that they could overlay images and make these new photographs. And so I wanted to do it for real. I made these kind of clunky photocopies and started to put them in landscapes, and I made a film of this with this Jodrell Bank telescope where it looks like it's in the landscape. So back in the 90s, I kind of got interested in the look of these astronomical structures. And these are postcards from '97. So I had a residency at Laoghaire House Print Workshop, and we do these big images, these little postcards you can take away if you want them, of the telescope. But then, but I guess in the last, how long ago was that? Sort of 20 years ago. So things kind of change. And after going to Jodrell Bank, I just wrote down, so that was 94, and then 96 I went to Chile. I was a printmaker, and you could go on exchanges to other print workshops around the world, and I got on this exchange to Santiago, and I managed and I asked the British ambassador if he could, because when you're young you sort of just try things out. I asked the British ambassador if he could help me go to the observatories, the European Southern Observatories. It turned out that his secretary was a friend of the director, and so I got on a coach at 9 o'clock at night and was dropped at 2 o'clock in the morning in the middle of the desert, and was able to go to the European Southern Observatories that are in the desert there. And was really interested but by the conversations that I had with the astronomers, both at Jodrell Bank and there, because I guess one of the similarities seemed to be that we were all struggling to get funding to research projects that seemed unimportant to general survival. And kind of both, the astronomers seem to have this sort of slightly marginal existence in the way that the artists do, staying up all night in these observatories, with a very odd life. So I suppose there was some kind of intrigue there. Well, then in 2000, I made a piece of work on the internet in which I used webcams. I managed to link up webcams of observatories around the world with the coordinates of the International Space Station. So at that point, so I'm the sort of artist that likes to use different media. So at that point the internet had come along, so I was trying to think of a way of using the internet, and the internet is very placeless. So I became interested in satellites because they seemed placeless. They seemed to be equally distant from anywhere on Earth, although they follow very specific paths. And I realised that if I, as an artist, wanted to make work about satellite technology, I needed to become a real expert, because you can't just dip in, you need to really know what you're making work about. I had a residency at the University of British Columbia. By that time I'd really gone off programming, because it seemed to take over my life, and I just used to knock on doors and ask people if they were connected to any satellites. So I got talking to the astronomy department, and the postal department were connected to satellites, and so I did a mapping of that. Google Earth was there. I've got pictures on my computer. I don't think I've got any pictures here. And then I had a fellowship at the Space Science Lab, as you said, at UC Berkeley, which is a NASA-funded lab, and they launch incredible satellites. They do incredible work, and it's very overwhelming. Maybe one thing we might want to talk about is why artists get interested in particular materials. There's something about the material of science which I think is incredibly intriguing, as well as the technologies of science that I've got interested in. And then I did a few commissions when I was back in the UK, in London, in schools, and did the image that's on the poster.
Oh, this colourful one?
No, of this event, of people in a circle.
I think it's on the table, isn't it?
If there is one.
Yeah, this one.
Satellite stories.
Yeah. So this is much later. This is 2008. So I'd stopped making images by then, and when I was at the Space Science Lab, the thing that really interested me was the conversations. We sort of exploring these conversations with the scientists, and I was asking them about lost spacecraft, because when I asked people about the spacecraft that they'd lost, and there were quite a few for different reasons, the emotion came up. I could hear, the science is a very emotionally understated pursuit very often. But to understand those incredible connections that the people who made the satellites had with spacecraft that are planets was incredibly intriguing. So it was kind of that I was trying to tap into. Well, this event, I got the scientists at Mullard Space Science Lab, which is in Surrey, to give a guided walk around this beautiful garden that surrounded their lab, and to talk to visitors about their experiences. And here, we're in a circle. There's a drummer So he started drumming, and then we all walked to this place where he was drumming, and quite naturally stood in a circle. And then different scientists talked about launches, and they talk about the sound of the launch being incredibly powerful. And then that was a pretty interesting event, because it made the words of the scientists, the experience of the scientists, it put it to the forefront, the foreground, whereas it had always been in the background of their work. And they were really interested in how that happened and how their experiences became valuable. So I suppose in terms of material of astronomy, the experiences are of interest to me, and I think to artists, and the technology, the materials that are used are really of interest. And then the visualities of the images that come from astronomy, both of looking at planets, but also the spectacle of observatories themselves is also, I think, part of what intrigues me. But straight after this, I went to India, as you were saying, and worked in Bangalore for a long time, for a couple of years, because the Chandrayaan spacecraft had launched. A lot of the work I did was with children. I might want to look at these as the conversation goes on, because they always bring up their own kind of stories. People notice things. We went to the ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organisation. In 2008, they sent the Chandrayaan spacecraft to the moon, and since then they've sent a probe to Mars and sent up a telescope recently. With some children who lived in slum areas near to ISRO, we went to look at the deep space antenna. So these are some of their drawings of that, which and they did interview portraits. So they drew the people who had made the technology and operated it. So I think they're rather beautiful, these, and so there might be things within those that you might want to look at. So the work I did, I guess, stopped being drawings and images, and it started to be working with groups of people and trying to, I suppose, shift foreground and background of what it was that was happening with space science and astronomy. So perhaps to bring out the visuality of what was happening and the experiences of what was happening, which can happen, I think, through artwork. So maybe I'll just leave that.
That's great, thank you very much. Marek, would you like to continue the conversation by telling us about your professional history and what your recent practice is comprised of?
Okay, that's quite interesting actually from what Joanna said, because I think there were a number of sort of points of contact there which you might not expect. So I started out by having what is for scientists a very conventional career path. I went to university to study physics, and then I did my PhD in radio astronomy actually at Jodrell Bank. So your little postcards there, that's the view I had from my bedroom window every morning for 3 years when I opened my curtains. So I did use the Hubble telescope and some other telescopes. So I was at Jodrell, and then I was studying distant galaxies, trying to understand how those galaxies were similar to and different to our own galaxy, and then also starting to try to understand how galaxies had changed and evolved from the Big Bang, the beginning of the universe, the chaos of that, to the highly structured and ordered universe that can support stars and planets and life. So I moved from there to Liverpool and then to Edinburgh, and then I went to Baltimore, which is where the Hubble Space Telescope is run from. I spent 10 years largely using Hubble, but also some of the telescopes in Chile as well, so I went there too to observe. And so really living this, as Joanna describes it, this rather marginal existence, lots of late nights, lots of days spent hunched over my computer analysing the data that's coming off these telescopes, thinking about, I suppose, these are quite sort of profound ideas. Where does everything come from? Looking at images, looking at light that no one had ever seen before, being the first person to see things, and looking at images of galaxies, seeing them as they were before the Earth had even formed, because the light had taken billions of years to reach us. So when it set out, the Earth didn't even exist. So it's quite weird concepts, and yet you're doing it all in a sort of a dingy university office, and then going out to the pub with your mates in the evening. So that sort of strange existence of working on quite profound things, but then having an ordinary life side by side. And then at some point I decided that what I really wanted to do next was to make a career in explaining that science to a much wider audience. And that's when I made the move to the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, which has been a cutting-edge observatory for 300 years, but since the 1960s has been more of a museum and a science centre. And so I took on this role of Public Astronomer, which is really a little bit like being a curator and also sort of a museum kind of learning officer. And the idea there is to bring all of this amazing science that astronomers are discovering to a wide audience, to school kids, to the general public, to the media, to anyone who will listen, really. So that was a bit of a gear change in terms of career, to going from a very focused on your work and sharing it with your colleagues to actually standing in front of thousands, millions of people and sharing it with them and trying to find the language to turn this quite esoteric stuff and these quite complex ideas into something which is accessible to everybody. And I do feel very strongly that it needs to be made accessible to everybody, because these are questions that are of interest to everybody, and of course the science is being paid for by the taxpayer, so they deserve to have it brought to them. So the kind of things that we do in Greenwich, we have a whole series of talks and activities for the public, for school kids. I curate exhibitions. We do things like the Insight Astronomy Photographer of the Year Awards, which I hope people like Damien are going to be entering their photographs into. And of course, but the central part of my role is to explain the science. But the more I think about how to do that, the more it's made me realise that science has always been an integral part of human culture, and it's not a separate thing that we should discuss in isolation from everything else that human beings do. And actually, the more you think about it as part of the wider culture, particularly alongside the arts and humanities, the more it makes sense why we're doing it, and what we can get back from doing that science. So I work alongside historians of science, and also social historians at the museum, and I also work alongside our art historians, because the observatory is part of a broader museum. Royal Museums Greenwich covers the National Maritime Museum, the Queen's House Art Gallery, and so our remit really is to look at art, history and science. And we're starting now, the last few years, we've got some really exciting, dynamic new curators who are interested in looking at the intersection between science and history and the arts. And so quite a lot of interesting stuff is starting to happen. So that's kind of where I'm at. And normally when I come and give talks, I'll pick a subject in astronomy and I'll sort of, explain the science and all the latest discoveries. And this evening I kind of thought maybe I wanted to take a slightly different approach. So I've just run off just 4 pictures, images, which I'll just very briefly talk through and hand round. And I don't have a sort of a coherent story that I want to tell you. I'm going to tell you a story about each of these images, and let you come to your own conclusions about how those stories link together, and perhaps how they link into what Joanna has just been talking about. So the first story, the first image that I want to show you is this one, and I'll hand it round in a moment. It's an oil painting by a guy called Charles Piazzi Smythe, who ended up being Astronomer Royal for Scotland at the observatory up in Edinburgh. But when he did this, he was working at one of the other Royal Observatories at the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. And if you've been to Cape Town, you might recognise the view. This is looking from sort of the foothills of Table Mountain. Cape Town is below you, across Table Bay, and here's the mountains on the mainland. And what he's doing here is he's painting the Great Comet of 1843, and this is a scientific image. It's an oil painting. This is really just before photography kicks off. So if you are a scientist and you want to record your observations, you have to paint, you have to draw, you have to be an artist, in other words. But he is trying to accurately record the appearance of the comet. So this is taken obviously just after sunset. So he wants to show you the extent of the comet's tail. He wants to show you the position of the comet against the background constellations. He wants to show you the relative brightness of the comet relative to those stars. So there is a lot of information in this picture. This is a scientific image. But someone like Joanna, who has a background in the history of art, some of the rest of you, I think if you look at it, you'll recognise this is absolutely painted in the artistic conventions of the day, painted within the conventions particularly of the sublime, and you think of a lot of things like Caspar David Friedrich when you look at this. So he is absolutely rooting his scientific image within those artistic traditions. So this is a painting by a professional astronomer who is also an amateur artist. So I'll pass that round and you can have a look at it. And then the next painting, so this is from our collection actually in Greenwich. This one is from the collections at Tate, it's actually in Tate, Britain. This is from just a few years later, and it's by an artist called William Dyce, who is associated with the Pre-Raphaelites. He wasn't one of the Brotherhood, but he certainly hung out in the same circles, and this is very much in that early Pre-Raphaelite style, that sort of photo-realist sort of absolute detail, but also with that kind of very romantic kind of aura to it. And the painting is called Pegwell Bay, October the 5th, 1858. It's a very, very specific time and place that it's pegged to. And here is, I think, the artist's family. I think the artist is here in the background. And if you're familiar with that part of the Kent coast, this is a very famous beauty spot. Even in Victorian times, it was where you went to the beach for a day trip. Of course, this is October, so they're wrapped up in their shawls. And here's his family on the beach in the evening, and as the light is fading, the sun is setting, and they're picking up fossils, looking for interesting rocks. And you've got multiple layers of meaning, I think, to this picture. And I'm not an art historian, but my interpretation of it, perhaps as a bit of a geeky scientist, but here are the family, and they're doing that very Victorian pastime of sort of, amateur geology, picking up the rocks, looking for things in the rock pools. Behind you have the strata of the cliff, and this is exactly that period when geology is really taking off, and people are starting to realise that the Earth is much, much older than had previously been assumed. And of course, you're just a few years off Darwin's Origin of Species, so you're about, with hindsight, their world is about to be rocked by this really quite shocking revelation that we are part of nature in a way that religion is not comfortable with, and that you can start to see yourselves, human beings, as part of this great story. And hard to see on this printout, but from the actual painting, a little bit easy to see. In the sky there's this little streak, and this is Donati's comet, which is just reaching perihelion around about this time, and would have been something that everybody would have seen in the night sky. Of course, very little light pollution in those days, so everybody in Britain, across Europe, would have seen Donati's comet. And again, they're starting to realise this is now over a century and a half after Edmund Halley has worked out that comets are these things that orbit the sun on quite long orbits sometimes. So again, you've got these things here, the cliffs, the geology, and the astronomy, which is really putting that moment, that little domestic moment of the day trip to the beach, into this vast perspective of geological and astronomical time, and then he roots it in a very specific date, 5th of October, I think, 1858. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, but this is a professional artist, but doing something which I think is quite scientific. So again, I will pass that round for you to have a look at. Very beautiful painting, very famous painting. Do go and have a look at it in Tate if you get the chance. And then we're going to leap forward 150 years, and this is sort of a moment that kind of was quite profound for me. And this is going from painting to photography. Very, very famous image from the Hubble Space Telescope. It's called now the Pillars of Creation. It's these great fingers, towers of gas in the Eagle Nebula, several light years long. And this was, for me, the moment when astronomy really made it into the mainstream. Of course, astronomy has always been popular. Even in Victorian times, there would be public lectures on astronomy. Greenwich was very heavily involved in this. So, the interest has always been there, but this is when astronomy went viral and really hit the media, and this is 1995, the internet is just getting going, and this photograph went viral. It's when Hubble really showed what it could do. And this beautiful image, you can see the 3D nature of it. Of course, there's a lot of science in here. The different colours are telling you about the different chemical elements. The image was taken for scientific reasons, but then reprocessed for public consumption. But it went viral, and it was all over the news, all over the internet. It took the astronomy world by surprise. I'd just been out at the Space Telescope Institute and had just come back to Edinburgh when this picture went live, and we were all stunned by it in the astronomy world. and then were stunned again by the way that it had received this sort of public acclaim and it was in the newspapers. And I think what's interesting about it though is the way this image also harks back, like the Piazzi Smythe painting, very much to traditions of the sublime. It gives you that sense of awe and wonder. Even the colour palette, which has been selected, these are not natural colours, this is not what it would look like if you flew there in the Starship Enterprise, but the colour palette has been selected, A, to highlight the interesting science, the different gases that are present, but also it very much harks back to the colour palette that you get from those sublime paintings. You think of Turner, you think of the Piazzi Smythe, you think of Caspar David Friedrich, you think of the great American landscape painters of the Hudson River School later in the 19th century. And it very much is evoking that. And I think because in order to allow us to interpret the scale of this image, you need to root it in familiar things, in familiar earthly landscapes where we have a real sense of the scale. And so using these colours, the blue for the background, the orange and brown for the foreground, allows us to interpret this as something vast, something that is much bigger than we are. So again, I think at a moment where, with hindsight, the connection between astronomy and art comes out very, very clearly. And then just a few years later, or actually around about the same time, this is another very famous photograph, and this really relates much more to my own field of research. This is the Hubble Deep Field, again from the late 1990s, and there have been further iterations, deeper and better versions of it over the last few years, but this is the original, if you like. And it's got this very characteristic chevron shape to it, and that's because the camera, the Wide Field and Planetary Camera 2, which was in use on Hubble at the time, has actually 4 chips. And you can see them 1, 2, 3, 4, and the idea is to give a mixture of a nice wide field, so covering a largish chunk of sky, and then this 4th chip here actually gives you much more detail. So it's got the same number of pixels, 512 by 512, but they're smaller. So you get much more fine detail in that part of the image. So you get the best of both worlds, if you like, a wide field, but also a little patch of it where you get lots of nice detail. And so that kind of chevron shape has become characteristic of that period of Hubble's imaging career. Its camera now has a new camera which doesn't do this. But in some ways, it's an arbitrary shape to the image which is defined by the technology. That's just the most efficient way of getting that compromise between wide field and detail in that central patch. And when I say this is a wide field, it's actually a tiny patch of sky. If you take a grain of salt and hold it at arm's length, that is the area of sky that this image is covering. And Hubble was told to stare at this patch of sky for 10 days. And through most telescopes, if you look at it, it looks like nothing. There's nothing there. There's no stars. It's just black. After 10 days of staring and gathering light, this is what Hubble could see. And pretty much everything in this image, thousands of objects, is a galaxy. So a galaxy made of billions of stars. And really what this image showed us was what we had suspected but had no absolute proof of, which was that the universe is absolutely chock full of galaxies. And if you think of this multiplied over the whole sky, it shows us that there really are billions and billions of galaxies out there. And so again, quite a profound moment from this, a philosophical moment, I think, from this very scientific piece of data. And the last point that I kind of want to make is that I was using Hubble and I was making images not quite as spectacular as this. I was sort of zooming in on some of these objects like this and trying to make really detailed studies of them. And of course I was taking photographs, but for all that time, the 10 years that I was using Hubble and other telescopes and making these images, I never thought of myself as a photographer. And that realisation only came much more recently when I was based in Greenwich and I was talking to the artist Wolfgang Tillmans, who is a photographic artist. His photographic practice carries a huge range of subjects, but he's also very interested in astronomy, like Joanna. And some of his photographs tackle astronomical themes. And what interested me about his work was that he was showing his astronomical photographs alongside his photos of all sorts of other things here on Earth. Some of his photos have a political dimension, some of them have a much more kind of intimate dimension. He photographs architecture, he photographs nature, he photographs people, all of these things, and alongside that he shows his astronomical work. And so I wanted to meet him because I wanted to try to understand how he was thinking and why he was juxtaposing the astronomy, or perhaps not juxtaposing it, just placing it in that context. And he articulated something which I'd been sort of groping towards in my work at Greenwich as well, and that was that I wanted to bring astronomy back from this marginal thing. Yes, it's exciting, and we all get excited about it, but we think of it as being way over here and not related to our everyday lives. And I wanted to say, no, actually, astronomy is directly connected to our everyday lives. As an astronomer, I look at the beautiful countryside outside, and I see that as being made of everything there, all of the living things, the air, the water, the stones. They're made of the ashes of dead stars, and all of that life is powered by nuclear fusion in a star which is shining over our heads. And that's my astronomical view of the world that we live in. Our everyday life is astronomical. And Wolfgang, describing his work, he came up with this great phrase. He said, life is astronomical. And so in that sense, all of his other photography was also astronomical photography, because everything was taking place on a planet, in a solar system, in a galaxy, in the universe. So he didn't see that breakdown. And as he talked about his work and how he approached his photography and how he approached making his photographs, I suddenly realised that all of those thought processes that he went through as a photographer, as an artist, were exactly the same stages of thought that I went through planning my Hubble photographs, and that's when I realised that I was a photographer. So I'll shut up now, I think I've said enough, but maybe that's kind of giving you an idea of the direction that I'm moving in as a scientist, and how I've realised that I'm sitting in the same territory as artists like Joanna.
Great. Thank you both very much. A lot to take in, actually, from both of you. I'm sure everyone's got lots of things which they'd like to ask, or like to say. I've got lots of questions, but I'd like to give everyone else a chance to ask Joanna and Marek some questions now.
I think you're sort of starting from your artist to the photograph. It's really a sort of a technology development. As we've gone through the ages, you've got the technology development which is recording history. And I think in terms of the astronomy side, it's exploded because of technology, in as much as the photography developed so much with the equipment and the technology they've got to do that, and the internet, which has exploded it to the world. And before that, I think everybody was too insular, if you like. When I was a youngster, you never knew what was going on in the world. I can remember at school, I've always been interested in astronomy, and I said to the teacher, can we talk, we were just talking generally one day, he said, can we talk about space? And he just said, well, there's nothing up there, just a vacuum. And that was it. How wrong could he be? You know? But a lot of it's to do with recording history, technology development, recording what it is. And I think what people don't realise is whatever they do, they're always looking back at history. And that's what people forget. You look at a star, the light left it there 100,000 years ago. You look at the sun, it left there 8 minutes ago. It might not exist now. So whatever you do, whatever you view, you're always looking back at history to some extent.
And I think that relates to what Joanna was saying about Henry Bergson as well, and his ideas of time.
Yes, it's intriguing, isn't it, how that comes together.
These kind of alternative notions of time and how actually things are happening always at different rates and different places in the universe according to gravity. Is it fair to say that this notion of time being kind of slightly less linear kind of stemmed from Galileo's discoveries, and it's kind of developed and become more complex since then?
Well, I think the big change really came 100 years ago with Einstein. Newton in the 17th century wanted to have this very clockwork universe, and the idea was that time was this sort of immutable substrate that was the same for everything and for everyone, and you could peg everything, to a particular time, and that would be the same, and it was a bedrock. And of course, in the 19th century, they start to realise that this isn't quite working, and then Einstein comes up with this new way of formulating time and space, which is your revelation. You're relating this to, and it's around the same time as Bergson as well. Very interestingly, I think there is this thing at the beginning of the 20th century with Einstein and Bergson in philosophy. You've got people like Picasso and Dali, who are clearly being influenced by these ideas that things are more mutable than we like to think. And of course, throughout all of that, as you said, you've got photography, and photography's relationship to art and science is very interesting, but its relationship to time is fascinating, because you're recording a moment. In astronomy, you're recording a moment which is a moment that's already passed, sometimes millions of years ago. But of course, actually, you're not always recording one moment, because you have an exposure time, so you're collapsing a series of moments into a single image. And so all of those things are sitting within photography, waiting to be dug out. And the relationship between astronomy and photography is hugely strong. Piazzi Smythe, who painted that oil painting at exactly the time. He's doing that.
Is that the fossil one?
It's the first one with the comet. So while he's in Cape Town painting his comets, he's very excited about photography. And a lot of the early pioneers in photography, Piazzi Smythe, but also John Herschel, were astronomers. They see the potential of this technology. John Herschel, he invents the English word photography, snapshot, positive, negative. So even our language of photography comes from an astronomer. But later in life, he's great friends with Julia Margaret Cameron, arguably one of the first fine art photographers, and they're swapping ideas and tips, and she takes the famous photographic portrait of him. So these connections are wiggling all the way through. And then, in the 70s and 80s, when astronomers want to record light in a way that photographic emulsions and glass plates cannot do, they push a new photographic technology, which is the digital chip, and now we have that. And we all use that, and that's something that astronomers had a very big hand in developing in the 70s and 80s. So again, everyone using a digital camera now is, in a sense, using a tool that was developed for astronomy.
Well, so people probably don't realise there's more technology in that than there was in the rocket that went to the moon.
Oh yes, absolutely.
I was sat there at the control station about a month ago.
Were you?
Yeah.
I believe you can download all of the kind of code from the original Apollo missions from GitHub now.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but of course, and tonight is the anniversary, isn't it? So it was the 20th into the 21st of July was the anniversary of the first moon landing. So quite an auspicious evening, I think, for us to be here.
You raised a very good point about how technology kind of just pushes everything forwards, and it changes the way that people think, because, not only photography, as you pointed out, I'm thinking also about the invention of, steam trains and Greenwich Mean Time, and how that kind of affected the way that people think about time and travel and distance. And then I think the sort of advent of the internet and the way that these images now can be shared has again changed the way that people think about time. Everything becomes more and more instantaneous with each development.
Well, and our understanding.
Yeah.
I was wondering, the people who take photographs, right, of stars, planets, and I wondered, and I'm really curious about, because I don't do that, but I'm really curious about what happens, because it takes an incredibly long time, doesn't it, to get the technology working, and
I'm wondering
why you do
my
it.
interest was to get into astrophotography, and I went to some lectures, and I thought you had to get a big telescope and lots of equipment and connect it to all different things, and I'm going back a few years, and the guy just said, "Have you got a camera?" "Yes." "Well, just take a photograph."
Yeah.
So I became an astrophotographer.
With digital cameras now,
And that's all you need.
It is now.
And you
can almost do it with these now. They're getting good. I mean, I took one the other day through the telescope at Greenwich. I just put this up to the eyepiece and took a picture of craters on the moon.
Put it on the telescope and click, and you've got an incredible image.
In Bangalore, at the Bangalore Astronomy Club, which is big, they grind their own lenses and make I was curious how much technology people were involved with, like material making people were involved with
making their own. That's so wonderful. That's almost like a step up from doing like pinhole kind of exposure cameras.
Yeah, I mean they just people do it because they love it. But I think there's something about making your own connection to something so far away that seems very poignant about.
Well, people like Patrick Moore, that was how they got started, was actually building their own telescopes. So I think people still do that, even though
there are a certain number of amateur astronomers on social media. I follow quite a few groups, and you get people now to get on there, and they've made a big Dobsonian telescope themselves that ran their own mirrors. So. Yeah,
which is exactly what lots of people like Galileo would do.
That's what they did.
They made their own because they had to.
This is a chip that, so I'm so impressed by your balloon because I did a week's workshop with 20 artists and hackers in Spain. They didn't manage to get their balloon up into space, but somebody made this chip. And people wrote different things about them. So the chip was I think this was to record sounds on Earth, and then we were also trying to connect to satellites. But they were talking a lot about how that part of the connection to what you see is about if you make your own technology, then you get this deeper.
I think it's people taking a technology and having the initiative to adapt it to some other subject.
And being willing to
understanding the light frequency, understanding the sound and how you can record it, etc. By taking the spectrums and analysing the spectrum so you can see what components are in that particular atmosphere, whether it's oxygen or nitrogen or whatever, or hydrogen. It's development and using the technology into another field.
But also then making those instructions available to other people. I mean, in terms of just being able to build your own telescope, build your own computer chips, that sort of thing is so much easier now to learn because there are people who are making those kind of tutorials online in their pastime and sharing it. And it's making something which would have seemed phenomenally kind of esoteric and very scientifically advanced 50, 100 years ago, something that almost anyone can have a punt at, and that's really wonderful.
I have to say, I'm always amazed at just what you can find on YouTube.
Yes.
Somebody mentions a name or a topic or something, and you can put it into YouTube, and somebody's made a video on it. It's amazing.
Yeah, the internet's marvellous for teaching yourself how to just find objects in the night sky for yourself, so you know exactly what you're looking at, and then start taking photographs. That's how I've learned, mostly self-taught, but using the internet and other people's knowledge and just tapping into that. And I've also done it myself. If someone's spoken to me and asked me about my photography, and then I've gone on them to then speak to them and told them how I do things and suggested ways that they could do it, and they've gone and took their own photographs of star trails or the space station coming over. It's quite a marvellous thing, I think, for sharing ideas and techniques and new photos at the end of it.
The whole idea of the internet, though, is sort of like an intersection between art and astronomy anyway. Just the idea of it, really.
Yeah, when I take a picture of the night sky, especially if it's a wide field image of a constellation or a star trail or a comet in the sky, I like to include a terrestrial object, like it's just a tree or some houses or something, and just connect the Earth with the sky and the satellite that you're imaging, or the planets. Or
how do you mean about the internet?
Just the idea of the internet, because it uses all the things from space and art, and it brings everything together into sort of one huge giant. I'm not going to say universe, not universal, multiverse almost.
Could I ask a question, Joanna, about because to do with satellites, and it's something, satellite technology and GPS is something which has obviously got some bad press recently, and it's been quite a hot topic kind of in contemporary art for a few years now, this idea of surveillance and big data, which is fueled in part by businesses kind of keeping tabs on people's whereabouts through GPS tracking, and I mean, to some people that's quite a kind of dark idea, but your work to do with satellites particularly is very positive, and I wonder whether that kind of possibly slight shift in tone has made you kind of look at it differently?
Positive. But yeah, I mean, I think, okay, so in terms, it's all the things that you do as an artist, I suppose you're often trying to do a number of things on different registers, sort of through the same work. So
was I being a bit too reductive by saying positive?
No, you weren't. I was thinking I'll talk about the positive, and then I guess talk about the thing you're trying to do that's critical, and then maybe other people who are doing art could talk about what they're trying to do. I mean, for instance, the work that we did with children doing, I did the PhD because I wasn't quite sure of the right or wrong of what we were doing, this thing of working with children and scientists from the Chandrayaan mission. It was a fantastic project. We did this 2-week workshop, and the kids got to go to Israel and got to talk to the people who made Chandrayaan, and they got to see the dish that was tracking Chandrayaan. And they made these great pictures. But at the same time, so here's a security guard, he's got a gun. So you have to go past him in order to get inside. And the reason why we were doing this, I was based at this art school in Bangalore, Srishti, and the reason we were doing it was because we wanted to work with ISRO more closely, but they'd refused. So we kind of went ahead by making friends with scientists, and in a way, it was like you're trying to change things in the world, and you're just an artist, but being kind of insignificant can be really helpful for going harsh undercover and getting yourself into ISRO and getting the kids in there, and also being able to begin a conversation with a highly technocratic organisation. So I did it because I noticed that the spacecraft that went to the moon, its purpose, the people who were making it were from a kind of smallish group, and the uses of the moon were going to be for resources, for mineral resources. This was the talk that there was about why we're going to the moon, and that there weren't enough conversation. There wasn't a big conversation about why this technology was being used, for what kind of purposes it was being used for. There weren't enough people in the conversation. So the kind of little thing that we did were these workshops in Bangalore, in order to try to make a ripple that might go a bit further, and it was kind of activism. When we did that panel discussion at the Republic of the Moon, so there was an exhibition in London that the Arts Catalyst did called Republic of the Moon, and I exhibited the work from moon vehicles with some of these drawings and some of the other things that people made. And yes, I think it was very positive looking. You're getting people involved in space, in an education project about space. But at that panel discussion, I was able to sit next to Bernard Foyne, who's the executive director of the Lunar Working Party. So he's the person the people who decide what's going to happen on the moon. And I was able to ask him, how do you cope with descent? How do you actually broker what happens on the moon? Who is it? Who does it? I think I said, how do you accommodate descent? And I don't think he had an answer, but I'd worked so hard to try to get to the point of being able to have that exchange. And sometimes, so the thing that you're trying to do as you're doing your art practice, as you're creating a network of interest, as you're doing things that are very positive and very motivating, is that you're also doing things underneath. And it wasn't just me who was doing that, it was the scientists as well who worked with Chandrayaan. They were also trying to turn things around within their organisation, because they also felt it was highly technocratic and hierarchical, and they couldn't make a difference. So it was like individuals trying to make a difference, which possibly is what happens when you're personally trying to take a picture of a planet rather than use a calendar photograph of the Hubble.
Because I watched a recording of a talk that you gave for Global Lunar Day, and you said how one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that India really did want this mission and wanted to go to the moon is because it was one of the only sort of superpowers at the time which had not had a moon mission yet. I can't remember exactly how many nations it is. I think it's 5 or 6 now, and that in order to kind of being part of that sort of that elite kind of group of nations, they felt it was something that was necessary. But then, interestingly, I think India is the only country out of that group of 6 who have signed the 1979 Moon Treaty, which is the one that says they will not use the moon for violent or aggressive means.
Yes.
China, the UK, the USA, Japan and Russia, none of them signed it, so they might put like a big laser on the moon or something, but at least India won't. And I wondered whether maybe that was, you were trying to remind them or kind of instill a slightly different kind of attitude towards that mission.
Definitely to bring, I mean, as I said at the beginning, to bring other conversations alongside I don't know, the scientific, there's something about technocracy, there's something about that kicks in, and yes, that needed to be adjusted. And very often when you look at where artists are working, are trying to do work, they're trying to make this adjustment in some kind of way. Yeah.
I think it's very interesting what you said earlier about how undervalued an artist can be, but also the kind of power that can give, like how unsuspecting some of those officials were, because she's an artist, she does drawings, we can allow her into these kind of corridors of power. But that infiltration is very...
The reason the scientists were also trying to alter things was because they had jobs and they couldn't say things themselves, so they kind of used this to do things.
There's an interesting artist called Nelly Ben-Hayoum who did this project called the International Space Orchestra, where she went to one of the NASA institutes and kind of managed to get her way in as a sort of an artist in residence, and her idea was to find scientists and engineers at the institute who could play an instrument, and she brought them all together over these sessions and put them together as an orchestra, and then they wrote an opera about the moon landings, which they then performed. And it's great because in the process she does manage to kind of, on the pretext of just getting them all together to play and to be musicians and to produce this performance, she gets them and the organisation to start to think a little bit more about why it's doing what it's doing and how it's working. And it comes over very cleverly in the film, and she has this great sort of persona of this sort of kind of innocent abroad, where she comes in and she's just like, well, we're going to, what do you mean by this? And she's asking these quite profound questions, and they're kind of, they're going, well, so it's well worth seeing if you get the chance. She's a really interesting artist. But I think there is an interesting thing going on there about the narratives that we as scientists and as science organisations tell about why we're doing this, because I think the scientific rationale for the Indian moon programme is the same as the rationale for the European moon programme, NASA's moon programme. It's trying to understand the moon and where it came from. But the narratives that we tell nationally and internationally and to the public and to politicians are very much tailored to what we're trying to achieve and what we want to get from them. So what I think was very interesting about your work and what that highlighted about the stories that the Indian Space Agency is telling to people in India, it's quite different to the way, say, the UK Space Agency would justify the space programme that is funded by taxpayers' money here. Whereas in India, some of the narratives that they tell are maybe about this is really pushing India forward as a technologically advanced nation. It's about national prestige. We can send something to the moon just like the Americans did. And then also this story about, there's minerals, there's wealth there, we can bring it back, we can make our country rich. Here, the stories are about, we do tell an economic story. Again, the UK space industry is one of the few bits of UK manufacturing which is actually doing well, although what Brexit will do to that I don't know, but certainly up until now it's been booming. We're very good at it, and that's something that the UK Space Agency, is a message that it really pushes, that we're good at this, it's good for the British economy. And the other message that they push is, because space is inspiring, these projects, if we do our public engagement and our outreach properly, these projects will inspire young people, girls and boys, to think about studying science at university, to go on to careers in science and engineering. Maybe not all of them will go into space, we don't need them all to go into space, but they will go on to be teachers, to work in industry, to go into finance, to take all of these analytical, numerical skills. And again, this is good for the economy. We need more scientifically trained people. Space will inspire them to do that. And so those are the messages that we use here, which are different from the ones in a developing country like India. And I do think that perhaps we're all missing something, which is, yes, it's inspiring and it makes us see the world in a different way, and perhaps that is worthwhile in its own right, and that's worth spending money on, in just the same way that there's a tendency now with arts funding to kind of say, well, the arts are worth this much to the economy, and if you build a new arts centre in this provincial town, then this will boost the economy by this amount. Sure, that's an argument that you can make, and maybe it's a good argument, and maybe it works. But actually, perhaps we should be funding the arts because it's important and it enriches our lives, and that's why we should be funding the sciences as well. So that's, sorry, a little bit of a political broadcast there, but there is a difference in the stories that we tell depending on where we're telling them and which audience we're telling them to.
Well,
and I think that came over very strongly in your work.
Picking up on what you're saying on that theme, and going back to your idea of the fact that astronomers and artists are marginalised, actually astronomy and art are the most easily shared experiences of all.
Yeah.
Because you step out your front door at night, you've got the sky. You're having the same experience, albeit at different times, as everyone else around the world. The internet has brought art to the masses. It's free. You don't have to go to an exhibition. You can see whatever you want on the internet. And that's the thing that I think the differentiating point, which makes people astronomers or artists or art lovers, is the emotional response to those things. And what's been evident to me is watching people talk with passion about their interests and their faces lighting up because of the joy it brings to them. And maybe it's because people haven't had that emotional connection with art or astronomy that they haven't felt that joy. So how do we bring that joy to them? How do we access those people and tap into the joy?
That's a very good question. I don't have a definitive answer, although it's something that, because of my job, it's something that I think about a lot. I think you're right. I think astronomers, scientists in general, and artists, we're trying to do the same thing. We're trying to work out what on earth does it mean to be alive, in this amazing universe that we find ourselves in. How do we make sense of this? And scientists and artists are trying to do that. The approach that we use, the methodology sometimes is quite different. In art, I think, emotion is very much at the core of it. Science is full of emotion too, but we are trained to slightly set it to one side, or at least to be able to step back from it. Doesn't mean that it isn't there. And I think one good thing that's coming out of the drive for people like Brian Cox for scientists to talk about their work, to explain their work, is we're being allowed and encouraged to actually show the passion again. There'd be no point doing it if we weren't passionate about it. No. But what's interesting is, now we've got scientists like Brian Cox showing the passion for the science and the excitement and the wonder and the awe. When you talk to artists and they talk about the detail of their practice, they can actually talk in quite dry and dispassionate terms about it. But that's not actually how we usually see artists. So with artists, the dispassion is the hidden thing, and the passion is on the outside. And with scientists, it's the dispassion that you see on the outside, and the passion is on the inside. And maybe we need to kind of get a 360-degree view of all of that, and then we'll start to see how close science and art can be.
If I can also offer an answer to your question, Rona, how do we share those kind of little sparks of kind of absolute joy and happiness. I think you've just got to really hold on to them and make the most of them. There's this interesting kind of parallel I find between scientists and artists in that sort of 95% of the practice is spent kind of filling out applications and doing meetings and things, and then there's the 5% which are the eureka moments which kind of make the rest of it all worth it. And I think Marek, your point as well about the kind of those slightly liminal peripheral lives that both kind of groups leads, but when I think they kind of come together, that's when the magic happens.
And we choose those lives. I think a lot of us who go into art or science, we're sort of attracted to those slightly marginal, liminal lifestyles. It's a personality thing. There's nothing wrong with that. But kind of connecting that back into the mainstream, I think, is really important, because I think we have a lot to bring to everybody.
Yeah. I think one thing that connects artists and astronomers is we're always trying to think unthinkable things. For example, recently I was trying to, obviously I know the term universe and what it means, but can there be more than one universe? And it's all these sort of questions that lie beyond that you...
Thinking the unthinkable, yes. Or the not thought before,
And the level of abstraction that there is in astronomy, which was very much encapsulated in the painting with the comet and the people picking up fossils, of how you deal with scale. The students at Srishti who I worked with, one of the questions they asked the Chandrayaan scientists was, how do you deal with these big numbers with this scale? And I remember that the reply was, well, we're just the same as you. There's no way we can imagine any better than you. How?
Yeah. What is a light year?
Yes.
Yeah. I can't picture a light year in my head. It's too big. But I can write the numbers for it, and you can do the maths. Anyone can do that maths. It's not difficult maths. But what does a light year mean? Well, the Hubble picture, the pillars of creation that I showed you, those structures are several light years long. That means that our whole solar system would disappear into a single pixel of the image. And yet, by taking those colours and those conventions from landscape art, the image at least manages to give you a sense of overwhelming scale of vastness. I mean, the actual vastness is even more than you could grasp, but at least it's giving you a sense of that, and it's using conventions from art and lessons from art to give you some kind of emotional inkling of what a light year is. And it's the art that's doing it, not the science, which I think is interesting.
It's a curious one, though, isn't it? Because that's also the criticism of it, that it was kind of coloured rather than giving the raw material. And I think often probably a drive that's shared between artists who start to work with the technology of astronomy and astronomers like yourselves who work with the technology, is to get your hands back on the image making, making that connection yourself and getting the raw data. Making that connection to the raw data without the intermediary that perhaps comes along with the internet. Because we're talking often about the internet, aren't we, in this conversation, and how that becomes an intermediary of cosmos. And I'm also curious about the words. We haven't talked about cosmos. What's cosmos? What's astronomy? What's space science? What's the technology? What's the image? And how these all kind of collide, but also have slightly different meanings. Astronomy, I understand, is the science of cosmos, but is cosmology and cosmos something that we try to grasp in pre-scientific, non-scientific ways?
I think, there's an interesting discussion about definition. I think when we talk about astronomy in a public context, we use it as a catch-all word, and sometimes it even includes things like space science and the International Space Station, which certainly, as a researcher in astronomy, that was a very different topic. Cosmology is, I would say, a branch of astronomy concerned with those big pictures, but it's only in the last few decades that cosmology really has been a science rather than a philosophical discipline, because it's only in the last few decades that you could test it with observation, and before that it really was just speculation, logical speculation using
modelling.
So it was philosophy and metaphysics and things like that, and I'm not dismissing those as disciplines at all, but for it to be a science it has to be something that you can test by experimental observation, and it wasn't that until within living memory, really. So these definitions are changing all the time, and astrology, which now is the stuff of sort of pretty much horoscopes in newspapers. But you go back 600 or 700 years, this was the reason people were doing astronomy in the first place, was because there was a belief for various reasons that if you could understand the motions of things in the heavens, it would give you some idea of what's going on down here. And ironically, as they got a better understanding of those motions, they realised that actually they couldn't be connected in that way to what was going on down here. So the drive to improve astrology ended up killing astrology and giving birth to what we think of as modern astronomy in that sense. But all of these things are connected.
Yeah, it was a terrific conversation in Bangalore around astronomy and astrology. And children seem to have a really good, really solid understanding of the stars, of the constellations, because there's so much astrology in kind of in the everyday. But really furious, we had a symposium, really furious disagreements around the idea that astrology and astronomy are connected. Happened as a symposium we did in Bangalore, because the scientists are desperately wanting to make the separation. But it's impossible, because it's part of it's
part of the history.
Yeah.
If you go back far enough, as you say.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And of course, it's not stupid to think that things in the heavens have a connection to things here on Earth. That's kind of the message that I'm trying to put out there, is that there are these direct connections. When people first started studying the sky, they noticed that as the seasons change here on Earth, there are also these cyclical changes that happen in step in the sky, the way the sun moves against the background constellations, the way the moon moves, the phases of the moon. All of these things you can tie to changes here on Earth. And of course the connection is that we're a planet moving around the sun. And as we do that, we get the seasonal changes, but as we do that, also our view of the heavens changes in step. So it's not that what's happening in the sky is causing the things on Earth, it's that the changes on Earth and the changes in the sky are being caused by the same thing, which is our motion. And that was really the realisation, that Copernican moment that splits astronomy and astrology in the West. But we still talk about harvest moons, we talk about the stories of the constellations that are linked to particular times of the year when they're up in the sky. And that's a cultural connection to astronomy and astrology, which I think it's silly and would be a shame to try and get rid of that. The stars are embedded in the way we think about the world around us.
I went to Egypt, and we were showing in one of the temples the very first astrological calendar, and it was depicted through the most beautiful drawings I've seen in a long time. Incredibly expressive, beautiful, subtle use of colour and shape and form, and this sense of kind of real fondness for a connection between what they were observing around them and the effects that they were noticing on the Earth. And it kind of blew me away, really, that subtlety of the artistic practice so long ago, and linking that to what they were observing, but then also a trip to India and Jaipur, and seeing the I can't remember his name now, but yes, and his sculptures. I mean, that was how we were talking about it. So he was investigating the skies through building these very odd constructions that he would measure seasons and times and dates, but it became the most beautiful installation. And it just seems that there's something natural about the way that we express our feelings about our relationship to the what's happening outside of our planet, but through a visual language rather always than through kind of a verbal, oral language. And it seems to be a long history of doing that.
That's having a bit of a resurgence again, isn't it, in the sense of things like land art,
yes,
where they're rediscovering those connections between the land and the sky, which are embedded in things like Stonehenge, and people like James Turrell with his skyscape sort of windows, where focusing your attention on the sky as a phenomenon, and he's building this amazing structure in the desert, isn't it, Rodin Crater, again, which is bringing in all of these astronomical connections. And again, I think you can detect it in things like this new movement, British landscape and nature writing, people like Robert Macfarlane, where it's that sense of people in a landscape, our relationship to the environment around us, and of course the sky and the seasons and the moon and the stars are also part of that landscape that we find ourselves in. So I think there is there is a kind of a mystical element to that, but it's not necessarily a supernatural or non-scientific element. I think you can absolutely reconcile that with our scientific understanding of the Earth, its ecosystems, its biosphere, and the wider universe. And I think there's a really nice kind of coming back together and rediscovering of those things that you saw in that Egyptian tomb from thousands of years ago.
I'd like to pick up on that as well with the pagan observances, obviously, of the seasons and the sky and the moon, and people that aren't thinking of it in any way scientifically. It's experiential. Yeah. It's very deep. It's a spiritual connection between all of them. Yeah. And the second thing I wanted to mention was the connection for me between art and astronomy, from what I'm hearing so far, is imagination, and our ability as artists to imagine, and possibly to use that in order to help imagine the unimaginable.
Yes. To articulate what we at the moment don't have the words to kind of. So I'm thinking mostly about dark matter at the moment, and one of the questions I wanted to ask is, I mean, just because dark matter, it's cool.
Please tell me if anyone knows.
No, I wanted to say that the image you brought of the pillars of life is a really fantastic example of how a kind of an aesthetic kind of decision can make something that is colossal, at least comprehensible. How does one make, which is totally incomprehensible, at least understand, like, can the arts or a kind of lateral approach help us kind of get a handle on what dark matter and dark energy could possibly be?
I think
it's called dark because they don't know.
We don't know. Yes.
That's why it's called dark.
It's not because it's technically unseeable.
I think that there's something there between all the universe, but they don't know what it is. Something's pushing the universe apart,
causing it to expand.
Yes. Yeah.
Anything that helps us to think about a problem from different directions is useful. I think something that art can bring to the discussion there is actually it's okay to not understand things, and it can help us to come to terms with not necessarily always having the answers, because we're never going to, I hope we never have the answers to everything. How boring would that be? So yes, I think it can give us the space to kind of step back from a problem, and sometimes in that stepping back you sometimes see a solution.
I'm personally really happy that the sciences, particularly the astrophysics and stuff, are now accepting kind of artists. For instance, quite recently, a position for an artist in residence has just been advertised at the Large Hadron Collider, if anyone's interested. I'm not making this up.
Yeah, I think that a lot of these science institutes see the value in that. I think one good example is, I think it was Paul Dirac. It was one of the physicists in the early 20th century who was very involved in quantum mechanics, and this very weird idea that they had at the time of wave-particle duality, which was that tiny particles, electrons, things like that, sometimes they behave like waves and sometimes they behave like particles, and very hard for anyone, I find it very hard to get your head around how can that be. We want it to be one or the other. That's our experience of the world. We see waves, we see little particles. Which is it? How can it be both? And I think it was Paul Dirac. I'd been reading about Cubism, people like Picasso, and he sort of thought, well, okay, if Picasso can show, the lady from all different sides on one flat canvas, maybe it's all right for an electron to be a wave and a particle at the same time. And so I think that there is, and of course once you accept that notion, don't necessarily know what it means, but you can then start to delineate it and start to work with that. So I think that's a useful conjunction between art and science. Oh, is it?
Yeah, so interesting moment.
More nature.
Did it grow
A beetle in my shoe.
He's looking
It
for
was
the
something,
bar.
but I was so intrigued by the conversation. It's been I think it was making a home.
Just to go back a few lines, you were talking about how all these phrases, how nobody really understands it, but everybody thinks they know what art is. You know, it's just art, oh yeah, well that's, you know.
Yeah, dive in.
That's, yeah, but to sort of mention astronomy or cosmos.
Well, I think art is subjective. I mean, for me, I either like something or I don't.
But have you had an experience where
appealing,
someone has changed your
if
mind?
it's appealing, fine. If it's not appealing, well, you know, you don't go down that road.
But I think
go
that,
into astronomy with that attitude.
I think that can sometimes happen in science. It's not supposed to, but I think sometimes you can see examples of where, because scientists are human, we become invested in an idea and we don't necessarily give full weight to contradictory evidence that starts coming in because we want it to be this. The good thing about science is that it does have this, eventually, a self-adjusting mechanism where the evidence builds up to a point where you can't ignore it anymore and suddenly you realise, actually, it can't be this, we have to build it up from scratch again. But I think it is always good, and perhaps this is something that art can do again for science, is to remind us that sometimes we might think we have the answers, but we might not have all the answers. And again, working at Greenwich has been quite interesting for me because I work with our art curators. I have exactly the same experience where, you know, a work of art appeals to me or it doesn't appeal to me. I get it or I don't get it. But sometimes if you have a knowledgeable person, a curator or the artists themselves there, and they start to explain, well, this is what I was thinking of, this is what I was doing. Suddenly the light bulb goes on and you're like, oh my God, actually, I thought this was nothing, now I think it's amazing.
So suddenly you don't feel excluded anymore,
Yes,
right?
yes.
It's taking it out of that ivory tower and going, actually, no, it is understandable, and arguably someone with a job position like yours that's doing the same, but for science, isn't it? It's taking it out of the, I shouldn't really use the word ivory tower, you know what I mean though, it's the communication.
Yes, it's making something accessible, it's opening the doors.
Artists often have lots of ideas, so there's more than one way of doing something. If you put a load of artists in one room, ideas will be bouncing around as to how to approach an idea, and that sort of reminds me of the idea of multi-universes. So I'm not sure if scientists have agreed on whether they exist, and if they exist, how they exist. So there's multi-ideas within.
Yep.
There's a huge amount of uncertainty and ambivalence within astronomy potential, of course. It's a big unknown. Yeah.
Yes. And sometimes what you find is, I mean, we were talking about dark matter, we still don't know what it is, but in the last couple of decades, we now have a pretty good idea of how much of it there is and where it is distributed. And so, you know, it's in the room with us now and always has been, but, you know, doesn't interact with the stuff that we're made of. But we have this idea now, pretty sure where it lies, where it's distributed, how it clumps together, and how much of it there is. And the evidence for that comes from several different directions, and they all give the same answer. And that's one of the reasons why we're pretty confident that we know how much dark matter there is and where it lies in the universe, because various different groups of people using very different lines of investigation, independent of each other, all kind of give you the same sort of answer. So that's a good example of lots of different things all coming together.
The notion of interpretation is within science, and you've kind of described different sources of information. It's certainly within art, and the ability to like or dislike is ever present. I don't know, with science you can like and dislike things, but the process of interpretation is often very underplayed in scientific.
And there's a lot of interpretation goes into science,
Yeah, and the framing, it's very interesting, those images you brought in at the beginning, that comet, the scientific image, which has this framing of the golden section and light and dark and things. Well, clearly that must still exist in the ways that we're now looking at the universe. I've been doing some projects around the Rosetta and the comet. It's really interesting how that's framed again in sublime terms, and it's named. And there is that, there's a certain perception that's coded, that's learned from history, that's overlaid on what's been discovered. It's really important to pull that apart. I think that's work to be done.
I agree.
It's good to be housed people.
Where's the little people?
I'm trying to hide underneath the projector. Sorry, gentleman with the black t-shirt and the glasses. I forgot your name.
Say we've looked at similarities between art and astronomy. It kind of struck me that possibly astronomers are in a very fortunate position insofar as you don't get people coming along and saying, "Oh, I don't like that. That's not astronomy."
Yeah.
So
Yes.
Can you see any other differences, as it were?
It's true to some extent, and within the sciences that makes astronomy quite unique. It's not the only science that enjoys that sort of freedom, I suppose. But if you think of something like climate change or genetic modification, a lot of bioscience, where they do have these direct real-world consequences, and a lot of the motion in science communication in those fields now is to move away from outreach to dialogue. So scientists actually talking to the public and having a conversation. That model, I think, absolutely great for astronomers to have dialogue with the public and to have that exchange. However, it's easy to see how somebody might say, I have a problem with your research on genetic modification of crops or of humans. Very, very difficult to imagine why someone would say, I have a problem with your research on black holes. I really don't like it, I really morally object to it. Because it doesn't have those direct moral implications. There are some...
you think there are moral implications in art?
Well, sometimes I think there can be. I mean, people can get very upset about.
Yeah, I think that's way more explicit in art. I
Sorry.
think for me, art practice tends to make ethics and that discussion of morality very much in the foreground, even the subject often. But with astronomy, my problem with the Rosetta mission, my interest in what's happened with the encountering the comet is that discussion of ethics and morality and subjectivity is there but not being discussed. This is a great line of discussion, I think, to talk about difference as well, because we are kind of talking about this conversion. But when you were a practicing astronomer, you were doing something I imagine you were doing something very different to what you're doing now. And a lot of the astronomers that I had conversations with talk about research and the small steps, tiny steps that you make. Whereas me coming in, or anyone coming in wants to know the big picture, dark matter, black holes, the big stuff. Levi-Strauss, the anthropologist, he says this quite patronising thing that the non-expert expects totality. They expect to be able to understand the whole lot and to see the big picture, whereas the expert knows that that's not possible and knows that it's in science it's these lifetimes of relatively small steps that have to be taken in order for other people's lifetimes to find out more about the subject that's being looked at, and that's very humbling. I found that very humbling when I was speaking to astronomers about that reality. Yes. Artists go wrong in a lot of ways, especially in these residences in CERN and NASA, and I think I did as well when I was there, thinking that they could take on board stuff, looking for the big picture. And there's a mistake there, for sure.
Yes, and I think as much as we talk about these beautiful Hubble images and the fact that they are drawing on lessons and ideas from art, and actually a lot of the people on the Hubble team who make those images come from, they have a science background, but they also have often an arts background and are practicing artists themselves, so they understand both those things. And you guys who do your own astrophotography, you know how you go from the raw image, which is data. You can actually the numbers in each pixel are telling you something about the brightness of the object, but as you process it to make the beautiful image, a lot of that information is discarded or removed because that's not what you're trying to convey to make the image look beautiful at the end. I mean, I think there's a truth in that image, but it's not the data that you can do numbers with. And I think there's a danger of when we talk about how similar those images are to works of art and how they sometimes provoke some of the same feelings that certainly works of art in the sublime tradition are designed to evoke. We shouldn't make the mistake of saying that they are works of art because they're produced for different reasons. The science data was taken to answer scientific questions. The PR image that's then made from that science data is produced to a large extent to sell science to the public, to the media, to politicians, to make people feel good about it so they feel like they want to carry on funding it. So there's a purpose there. If it has the same effect as art and asks some of the same questions as art, that may also be deliberate, but it's one part of what it is. And I asked Jonathan Jones, the Guardian's art critic, who is a big fan of astronomical photography, and he I think is not afraid to voice some quite controversial opinions in his columns. But I sort of put him on the spot and I said to him, "Are these Hubble images art?" And he paused and he thought about this for quite a long time. And this was in front of a big audience, so I really put him on the spot. And he said something quite interesting, which was that he said they are works of art in the same sense that a lot of medieval religious art is, because often these are works produced often by more than one person. These people are anonymous, so it's not about the artist as a hero. They're craftspeople. They're working within an idiom with certain rules and aesthetics, which is exactly what these Hubble images are being made in, and they're being made for a purpose. They're commissioned by the church for a particular purpose, to teach a moral message, to glorify church, to perhaps sometimes to promote the status of the people who have commissioned. So there are all of these ulterior motives, and yet they are very beautiful, and they give us an emotional and philosophical response as well. And I'm not sure. Again, I think I put him on the spot. This is something he was coming up with, but I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to explore in that comparison that he's making. But is a NASA Hubble photo a work of art in the sense that one of Wolfgang Tillman's astronomically themed works is a work of art? And I think the answer to that is no, although there are similarities between the way they are made, between the reasons why they are made, and between the effect that they have on the viewer. But I think you can separate them out as well. Discuss.
Yeah. If the photograph's art, if the photographer says it is, isn't it? Isn't that the answer?
Sure, but if I took one of my Hubble photos and said this is art, I think I'd be pushing it a bit.
Well, I think it's how you perceive it. I mean, I remember years ago somebody getting paid 20,000 and he put 3 rows of bricks on the floor.
Oh, it's photographing those today.
or somebody's hung a piano upside down in a hall. I mean, it's how you perceive art, isn't it? I can go on the top of a mountain and I can say, look at that view, it's fantastic, it's beautiful. And the voice next to me says, well, it's just a hill.
I think Marek, your point earlier about how with scientific research quite often there are differences of opinion until there's a kind of mounting evidence which indicates that one thing is almost certainly the right answer. That kind of has some pertinence here, because I do agree entirely with the statement that art is very subjective and everyone is entitled to an opinion on a particular piece. In terms of how the quality of art is measured, almost works in similar ways in terms of consensus and evidence. If enough kind of people from a particular backgrounds are in agreement over the quality of a piece of art, then generally it gets that status of yes, this is art and it is good art, but that doesn't mean it can't be contested. And that doesn't mean it's still, that doesn't mean it's not subjective either. We've gone a little bit off track, I think. But,
I think also there's something to be said though about whether an image is an image on its own and to be viewed in isolation, so you're presenting that one image, or whether it's an image that's been created as part of an ongoing practice, that is part of an ongoing story of an artist's thinking and their approach and what they did before and what they're going to do next. And their work is this long stream of activity. And that is different to a single image that someone might take for a particular reason. So I think there's a difference.
I mean, as an artist, I always try to avoid the question, which is art. So I think of it as I suppose I think of being an artist and art as an approximate category that some things fall into more easily than others, and the edges are less defined. I really like the way your question really opened up some interesting things about the notions about the Hubble photograph and craft and other ideas. What was I going to say? Lost it. Right track. This and this art and astronomy subject that we're looking at, I've lost the thing I was going to say. Carry on.
Come back to
Can I ask? So can I ask a question? Because you're both very obviously you've got a lot of experience where it comes to kind of cross-disciplinary collaboration, and that seems to be something which is on the rise at the moment in the sciences, in the arts, in education, in galleries, in scientific institutions. What do you think the research and education of the future will look like if this trend continues? Do you think that this is going to change the way that, for instance, I don't know, higher education courses are going to be structured? Could I take a module in both quantum physics and sculpture and do both of them as part of the same course, for instance? I know this is a bit more of a kind of social topic than, astronomical one, but just on that theme of science plus art, where do you think it's going to go?
It's tricky, isn't it? Because I hope we will move in a direction where it is possible to be more cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary. I certainly remember when I was at school, quite a while ago now, but having to make that choice between the humanities and the science subject. So I knew I wanted to study physics and astronomy, but I was really gutted that I had to give up history and French and English literature because I loved those subjects, and I sort of consoled myself with the idea that I can retain an interest in them, but of course I was never going to reach a high level of expertise without being able to be educated in them. And so you kind of have that CP Snow sort of two cultures thing, which was still certainly in my school kind of quite embedded in the way that you were allowed. You couldn't do maths, physics, and history because they were timetabled against each other. No one was going to change that. I think that's getting better, but there is always this thing of, to become good at something, you really do have to specialise and focus. And of course, as subjects progress, there's more to learn. So it's getting harder and harder, I think, just practically to bring in that interdisciplinary thing. But I think perhaps there are things that you could do in the education system that just, while you focus and concentrate on the thing that you're going to do, there is also some time set aside, a bit like the set aside around the edge of a field where you allow the flowers to grow and the wildlife to flourish, where in anyone's education there is that reserved area where all of those other areas, if you're a scientist, the humanities, if you're a humanities person, there's some science there, just to keep you connected and to give you, at a later point in your career, the chance to be able to step back from your specialisation into a broader picture. I think that would be healthy for everybody.
I think there's that connection across time, because Phil Coates, who's an artist who's in Northampton. I was talking to him and I thought he was only like a landscape artist and figure artist, because actually no, my background is in biochemistry and physics.
Wow, okay.
And that wasn't evident in what I'd seen, but he then showed me paintings that he'd done, and he said that's the way it is, and he references them, and he says it really is an integral part of his work, not something that he's left behind, and it's going to be more and more, so...
And I certainly know a lot of scientists who are, you know, in their private lives, accomplished amateur artists, musicians, and this is a very important thing for them, but it's still quite unusual for them to talk about that in the context of their work. I'd be interested, because I don't know as many artists, but how many artists have more than just an interest in science, but actually have some kind of formal training in science as well. I think that would be quite interesting too. I do have one friend in New York who did a physics degree and is now a visual artist. So that's one person. But yeah, I think it's less rare than we think it is.
I think it's a great question to ask. I think there's a real urgency about this question. I work with a group called Transtechnology Research at Plymouth, and we're looking at how and why, really the question why people from different disciplines come together to solve different problems. And the idea of transdisciplinarity is really interesting to look at and how it's happened historically. I'm in the UK at the moment for a few weeks, and then I'm back to Ahmedabad, and to a university where I've noticed that disciplines are quite separated, and we can talk about the future. Hopefully it will be transdisciplinary, but I think that things happen at certain moments, and they happen in different ways in different parts of the world, and I feel that the ability to be transdisciplinary is such a privilege, because it allows for a criticality that otherwise doesn't take place if you keep things. And yes, I totally go along with all the points all the things you've said about coming and going between interdisciplinarity and subject specificity. But I see in the very different social space that I've entered in this city, how segregation happens in many different ways, and when it happens between disciplines as well as between social groupings, there's a huge problem. And there's a kind of ideal that goes along with transdisciplinarity, and the ability to have conversations at certain times when they're necessary is absolutely fantastic, because there's a creativity in that meeting. There's a new thought space that emerges that I think has today from all these meetings. But there's an ability to be critical that's very precious, and it's not available everywhere.
I think on that note we're going to call an end to the discussion, but thank you Joanna, thank you Marek, thank you everyone else for taking part. This was fantastic. I'd also very briefly like to take the opportunity to thank Martin Steed, our cameraman, and who also contributed enormously to our space programme over the last couple of weeks, to thank the Eden Field Centre for providing this fantastic venue. It's really, really gorgeous. To Arts Council England and to Northamptonshire Community Foundation. And on your seats there are some feedback forms. If you don't mind taking a minute to fill them out, really helpful, helps us apply for more grants and do more cool things like this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.